Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a part of the medieval world that didn't come with shining armor or gallant feasts. It's quieter, more uncomfortable, and much more real. It's the story of what happened to those who didn't accept Christianity, when it wasn't just a faith, but the law, the culture, the world view, and sometimes the only allowed option. So if you're settling in for the night, dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's walk carefully through this forgotten corridor of belief and punishment. Let's be clear from the start. In medieval Europe, religion wasn't something you chose. It was something you were born into, expected to follow, and punished for resisting. Christianity wasn't just dominant, it was enforced, and the further you lived from a city, the more dangerous it became to ask questions, refuse rituals, or cling to older beliefs. The church wasn't just in the cathedral, it was in the village square, the tax system, the law courts, and even the food blessings at your table. Imagine a small village, surrounded by mist and woods. Life is basic. Fields, animals, weather, no books, no newspapers, just the rhythm of seasons and the ringing of the church bell. That bell didn't just call people to prayer. It reminded them that they were watched, that someone, somewhere, was always listening. In that world, belief wasn't a debate, it was survival. Most people didn't have the luxury of spiritual rebellion. They were too busy surviving harvests, illnesses, and taxes. But sometimes, someone refused. A man who followed old rites. A woman who never crossed herself. A family that kept strange traditions. And when they did, even quietly, people noticed. Not always out of malice, but out of fear. Because in a world ruled by heaven and hell, the unbeliever wasn't just wrong. They were dangerous. The church taught that heresy spread like fire. One spark could doom a whole community. So the response was swift. Sometimes it started with whispers, then suspicion, then, eventually, a visit, not always from knights or inquisitors, but from a priest, a magistrate, or the village elder with too much certainty in his voice. And that's when the choice appeared. Convert, confess, or face consequences. Those consequences weren't always immediate or bloody. At first, they were social. People would stop talking to you. You'd be excluded from markets. Your children might not be allowed in the church school. Your name would vanish from invitations, trades, and blessings. You were unclean, not in the literal sense, but spiritually. And that spiritual stain could cost you everything. If you continued to resist, the pressure escalated. Some were summoned before local councils, not grand trials, but gatherings of neighbors and clergy, demanding you explain yourself. Why don't you attend Mass? Why do you mutter in another language? Why were you seen burning herbs at night? And here's the terrifying part. You didn't need to confess. You didn't need to be guilty. Just being different was enough. Just hesitation, just bad timing, just an old story told the wrong way. Because in medieval Europe, belief wasn't a private thing. It was public, performative, and policed. And those who failed the performance, no matter how quietly, became suspects, not of a crime, but of a cosmic betrayal, and that accusation could follow you, even to your grave. Now imagine what happened when the church had more power. Not just a local priest frowning at missed mass, but full authority, courtrooms, guards, scribes, and laws written in Latin, because as the Middle Ages progressed, disbelief wasn't just frowned upon. It was documented, codified, and given a name: heresy. And heresy wasn't treated like a mistake. It was treated like a disease. The church believed that heresy could infect others, that one doubter could lead a whole village astray. And so, rooting it out wasn't just a duty. It was seen as mercy, a brutal kind of mercy that removed by sentence books, banished families, and sometimes lit fires under people who refused to bow. But we're not there yet. Let's stay in the village for now. Let's say someone refuses to convert. He doesn't attend church. He teaches his children that the world began differently. He questions the sacraments. He uses old words when blessing food. Maybe he lights a candle on the wrong day. That's enough. Not for everyone, but for someone, and one person is all it takes. A neighbor reports him, maybe out of fear, maybe revenge, maybe because they were told that silence makes them guilty too. The local priest is alerted, then the bishop, then maybe, if the case is strange enough, someone in a robe shows up with a seal. A man with ink-stained fingers and questions that don't have safe answers. This wasn't fast. Nothing in the Middle Ages moved quickly. Investigations took weeks, sometimes months. Witnesses were questioned. Old rumors dug up. Wives, brothers, cousins, all asked the same things. What did he say? What did he do? Who else was there? Heresy wasn't solitary. It was imagined as a web, and so the web grew. Some people broke early. Fear made them recite prayers they barely understood. They knelt. They cried. They begged. And sometimes that was enough. A warning, a penance, maybe a fine or pilgrimage. But others didn't break. They stood firm. Maybe out of belief, maybe pride, maybe confusion. And that's when the pressure truly began. The church had tools for this, not always physical. Sometimes it was isolation, being kept from your family, from your land. Sometimes it was loss of work, your trade forbidden, your property seized. But sometimes, yes, it was physical. We'll talk more about that later. For now, understand this. The goal wasn't just punishment. It was correction. Heresy was a wound. The church saw itself as the knife that cut out the infection. But infection is a dangerous word. It makes people afraid. It makes them cruel. And cruelty, when dressed in robes and lit by candles, can feel like righteousness. The church wasn't always brutal, but when it wanted obedience, it knew how to make people fear silence more than speech. It knew how to ask the same question in 100 ways until the answer changed, and it knew that if someone didn't cry, didn't fold, didn't confess, it made them look even more guilty. Because truth, in those dark rooms, was measured by obedience. By now, the village is divided, not openly, not with arguments or fights, but with glances, absences, and whispers behind doors. People stop looking you in the eye. Children are told not to play near your house. You feel it before you hear it. That slow turning of your name into a warning, and all because you prayed differently. Or didn't pray at all. The church, by this point, may have already sent a letter, maybe even a representative. They rarely arrived alone. These weren't soldiers. They didn't need swords. They brought paper, stamps, questions. And behind those questions, the weight of entire kingdoms. If you said the wrong thing, it wasn't just you who suffered. It could be your family, your farm, your future. Some tried to hide. Others fled. But running wasn't easy in a world without roads, passports, or maps. Most people had never left their region. Many couldn't read signs. Traveling alone meant hunger, wolves, or worse. So most stayed. Not because they trusted the system, but because they had nowhere else to go. If your case was considered serious, it might be passed to a larger authority. A bishop's tribunal, a religious court, or, in later centuries, the Inquisition itself. Now that word comes loaded with fire and fear. But it wasn't always so. At first, the inquisitors were more bureaucrats than torturers. They kept records. They asked long, repetitive questions. They offered chances to confess. But confession wasn't always a simple word. To confess meant to renounce, to reject your past, to declare publicly that you had sinned, misled, or wandered. And if you refused, well, that's when the options became fewer and darker. Not everyone was tortured. That's important to say. But the threat of it hung in the air like smoke, and the rooms where it happened were quiet, plain, and cold. No fire pits, no swinging blades, just rope, pulleys, chairs, and long hours. Pain wasn't just a tool for punishment. It was used to reveal the truth, or rather, to create a version of the truth that could be written down. Some people endured, others gave names, and so the circle widened. Your silence wasn't heroic. It was dangerous. If you stayed quiet, people assumed you were hiding something. And if you spoke, your words could be twisted. Did you really say that? Did you mean it like that? Could those words imply doubt? And what counted as heresy? It wasn't always clear. Denying baptism, mocking the saints, reading forbidden books, saying that bread didn't become flesh. Each region, each era, had different lines, and those lines were often drawn by men with power, not clarity. You might think, maybe it would be better to lie, to pretend, to fake belief. Many did. They crossed themselves in public, recited prayers by rote, attended Mass with a blank stare. But even that was risky, because if someone thought you were pretending, if someone questioned your sincerity, you were back in the same danger. In some regions, especially during heightened tensions, even being seen talking to someone accused could mark you. Guilt by association wasn't a metaphor. It was policy. And that meant heresy spread fear long before it ever spread ideas. So what did it mean to truly refuse? Not just to hide or delay or perform belief like a puppet, but to look a priest in the eyes and say no. That was rare, but it happened. Some people had deep roots in older ways. Others believed in distant gods. or none at all. A few simply saw the church as corrupt and wanted no part of it. These weren't loud rebels. They weren't standing on rooftops preaching. Most were quiet, private, tired. But even that wasn't allowed. There were places where Christianity hadn't yet taken hold. Remote valleys, forest communities, people who still sang old songs or buried their dead without a cross. The church saw these places as wounds, places to heal, but the healing wasn't gentle. Missionaries arrived with Bibles and banners, sometimes with soldiers, sometimes with kings. Conversion could be forced with taxes. Refuse baptism, pay more, refuse again, lose land, still refuse, face exile, or worse, for nobles or wealthy townsfolk, disbelief was political. You might be stripped of title, branded a suspect. If you held office, it could be revoked. If you taught, you could be forbidden. Universities, councils, guilds, all required belief, and not just vague belief, but specific, correct doctrine. Say the wrong thing about a saint, and suddenly, you weren't a philosopher. You were a threat. For peasants, the punishment was usually sharper. You didn't have titles to lose, so the church took what you did have: access, safety, food, or your body. In some cases, disobedience led to public rituals meant to shame. A man forced to walk through town in torn clothes, holding a candle, repeating prayers while children laughed. A woman made to kneel barefoot in snow, holding a stone as penance for unspoken sins. The idea was simple. If your soul strayed, your body would suffer. And if others saw that suffering, they might stay in line. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Some people resisted in secret. They gathered at night, spoke in whispers, lit candles behind locked doors. They weren't forming revolutions. They were surviving, holding on to scraps of belief that didn't match the rules. But belief is contagious, and even quiet resistance can grow roots. So the church responded with structure. In the 13th century, Pope Gregory IX established the formal Inquisition, not just roaming clergy, but an entire institution dedicated to rooting out heresy. It began in France and spread: tribunals, procedures, records. And with that came consistency and severity. Suspects were summoned, confessions recorded, names written in ink, and punishments decided with terrifying calm. Some were exiled, others were fined. A few were sent to monasteries for correction, but not all. Some, especially repeat offenders or public critics, faced the ultimate penalty, final punishment, not always by the church itself. That was the trick. The church declared guilt. The state carried out the sentence. Hands were technically clean. Spiritually speaking, punitive rituals became symbolic. Fire, they said, cleansed. Smoke rose to heaven. But it wasn't fast or silent. People gathered, not always from cruelty, but from curiosity. In some towns, final punishments were treated like warnings. In others, like theater. Parents pointed and said, "Don't be like them." But many walked to the flames quietly. They prayed their own prayers, whispered names of gods no one else believed in, and disappeared into history with no grave, no plaque, and no defense left behind. Because in that world, truth didn't save you, obedience did. By now, belief wasn't just a personal matter. It was a test of loyalty. To question doctrine was to question power, and power doesn't tolerate questions. The church had become the soul of the state, and the state had become the sword of the church. Kings ruled by divine right. Laws were written with scripture nearby. To doubt religion was to doubt the crown, the court, the order of the world, and so punishment became performance, not just to hurt, but to show. Outcasts weren't hidden, they were displayed. Processions marched them through town. Clergy read accusations aloud. Symbols were stripped away. Hair was shaved. Clothing marked. They were made visible so others would know what not to become. Inquisitors didn't always work alone. They relied on locals, people who watched, whispered, reported, sometimes out of faith, sometimes fear, sometimes just to settle old grudges. It didn't take much. A missed mass, a strange book, a single rumor, and the wheels began to turn. Those wheels turned slowly, but relentlessly. Some of the accused were educated, scholars, poets, midwives, healers, people who had read more than one version of the world. That made them dangerous. A peasant might confess quickly. A thinker might resist longer. And the longer they resisted, the harsher the tools became. Harsh questioning wasn't always applied, but the threat of it lingered. Sleep deprivation, silence, darkness, cold rooms, repetition. These weren't wild screams in dungeons. These were long hours of nothing, and that nothing exhausted people in ways that words could not. Eventually, many confessed. Not because they believed they were wrong, but because they believed there was no other way to survive. But survival had conditions. You might be forced to wear a cross-stitched robe for life, marked as a penitent. You might be forbidden to travel, teach, or own land. You might be publicly whipped or forced to crawl toward a church altar as the bells rang and the town watched. And even then, suspicion lingered, because heresy wasn't a wound that healed, it was a shadow that followed. Some families were marked for generations. Children of outcasts found doors closed, accused of inheriting wrong ideas, as if belief could be passed like a sickness through blood. It wasn't just the Inquisition. Local lords, bishops, and councils had their own methods. A town might burn an outcast without Rome's permission. A noble might imprison a thinker just to avoid conflict with the church. And in each case, the message was the same. Doubt was dangerous. The records from these times are thick with silence. Names are listed, confessions copied, but motives are missing. Did they really believe what they were accused of? Or were they caught in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong words? We'll never know, because the truth was never the goal. Control was. Sometimes, the accused weren't alone. Entire communities were marked. In parts of Europe, villages were suspected of harboring heresy, not because of evidence, but because they were isolated, spoke strange dialects, or had customs the clergy didn't understand. These communities weren't rebellious. They were simply different. And difference, in the medieval mind, was danger, priests were sent to investigate. Not just one or two, but entire delegations. They observed, took notes, asked questions that had no safe answers. Do you believe in the virgin birth? Do you recognize the Pope? What prayers do you say before eating? And if enough answers felt strange, the verdict was already decided. Punishments varied. In some cases, the entire village was fined. Churches were closed. Sacred objects taken away. In worse cases, homes were destroyed. Fields removed by sentence. People scattered. Families separated. The goal was not just to correct belief, but to erase old habits. Sometimes the people who refused Christianity weren't native to Europe. They were travelers, merchants, or refugees from distant lands. Some were Jews. Others were Muslims. A few followed ancient pagan traditions that had survived in corners of the world, untouched by empire. These people were tolerated until they weren't. In good years, they were left alone, allowed to live in separate quarters, follow their customs, trade, raise families. But when the winds changed, when crops failed, or war threatened, or kings needed favor from the church, tolerance disappeared. Edicts were signed. Deadlines were set. Convert or leave. Convert or lose everything. Convert or die. And many did convert, at least outwardly. They took new names, learned the prayers, appeared at Mass, but beneath the surface, they remembered, and in dark corners of the home, they still whispered old blessings, lit hidden candles, told stories in forbidden tongues. They were called conversos, or in some regions, crypto-believers. And for a time, they walked between two worlds, accepted in neither, protected by no one. Eventually, some were exposed. A servant heard a strange word. A neighbor saw smoke on the wrong night. A child spoke too freely, and the questions began again. Why did you not eat that meal? Why do you cover your mirrors? Why do you turn away from the crucifix? Sometimes the person accused didn't even realize what they had done. They'd spent years hiding, decades pretending, but the past clung to them like scent to cloth, and the church believed that even a hint of the old ways was a fire waiting to spread. So trials returned, and in some of the worst periods, they didn't wait for guilt. They assumed it, and the accused had to prove their innocence. How do you prove you don't believe something? How do you prove that your mind is clean? The answer, of course, is that you can't. Not completely. Not convincingly. Especially when belief is invisible, and your judges are convinced you've lied before. So the cycle repeated. Confess, repent, inform on others, or disappear. By now, the world had changed. Castles grew taller, cities busier, kings richer, but the rules of belief stayed the same. And if anything, they hardened as printing spread. Books became more common. So did questions. But more questions meant more fear. The church had survived plagues, wars, invasions. It didn't want new ideas tearing at its foundations. And so the definitions of heresy expanded. It wasn't just refusing Christianity. It was reading the wrong Bible, saying the wrong version of a prayer, translating sacred words into common tongues. Ideas that once would have gone unnoticed now became crimes. One book could be enough to ruin a man. A copied manuscript, borrowed from a traveler, passed between friends, read in secret, then found. And suddenly, everything you owned was evidence. Even silence was dangerous. If you didn't report an outcast, you might be treated as one. So people talked about neighbors, about family. Trust faded, and heresy wasn't always punished with fire. Sometimes the church used erasure. Your name struck from records, your children barred from inheritance, your memory buried in shame. In some cities, your bones were dug up and removed by sentence, long after you died. A second death, for the sake of appearances. And even among the clergy, belief was a burden. Young monks who asked questions were sent to silence. Scholars whose conclusions drifted from doctrine found their work banned, their libraries destroyed. A priest who tried to preach peace during a time of war might be accused of spreading weakness. A nun who heard voices might be holy or dangerous. It all depended on the mood of the bishop, the shape of the times, and who was watching. And watching became a habit. Records multiplied. Names were written carefully. Testimonies collected. Some tribunals kept archives stretching hundreds of years, filled with confessions, accusations, and signatures trembling with fear. One woman admitted to lighting candles at the wrong hour. Another man confessed to speaking to birds. A child repeated an old story from his grandmother and was sent to questioning. The line between culture and crime was never stable. It bent with fear, snapped with power, and yet people continued to resist. Quietly, secret gatherings, hidden symbols carved under tables, rings with strange marks, songs that sounded harmless unless you knew the old language. People held on, not because they wanted to change the world, but because they didn't want to lose themselves, and that, in the eyes of the church, was enough. To protect your soul was good. To protect your memory was suspicious, because the church didn't want you to keep your past. It wanted you to replace it. Not all resistance was hidden. Sometimes it took shape in movements. Whole groups who believed differently, who thought the church had grown too rich, too proud, too far from its roots. They weren't outsiders. They were often Christians themselves, just with different ideas about how to live, how to pray, what to believe. The Cathars in southern France believed the world was a battleground between good and evil, spirit and flesh. They rejected wealth, avoided meat, preached simplicity. The church called them outcasts, dangerous, corrupting, not because they were violent, but because they were convincing, too pure, too appealing. People listened, and when people listen, power gets nervous. So armies were sent, not small ones, crusades. Entire campaigns were launched to crush belief. Cities were besieged, villages removed by sentence. In some towns, the invaders didn't even ask who was guilty. Everyone was treated the same. One commander reportedly said, "Kill them all. God will know his own." That wasn't metaphor. That was a method. The survivors were hunted, one by one, questioned, tortured, marked, And in the ashes of those towns, the lesson was written. Belief was not a private matter. It was a public duty. Then came the Waldensians. They believed in living simply, in reading the Bible in their own language, in rejecting church corruption. They were peaceful, barefoot, quiet, but they were also defiant. They believed they didn't need priests to reach God, and for that, they were excommunicated, exiled, and hunted across mountains. Again and again, the same pattern. A new belief, a peaceful challenge, a violent response. And still, the church insisted it wasn't cruelty. It was care. They weren't punishing outcasts. They were saving souls. But that salvation left thousands dead. Many of these groups left no writings. Their books were destroyed. Their names recorded only by their enemies. What we know of them is filtered through fear and bias. The church called them liars, demons, corrupters of youth, and yet their ideas resurfaced. Centuries later, in other reformers, in other thinkers, in other movements that dared to ask the same forbidden questions. What if belief isn't obedience? What if truth doesn't belong to one institution? What if God hears everyone, even those who speak in whispers? But in the Middle Ages, those questions were too costly. One whisper could cost your home. One question could cost your child. One mistake could cost your life. So most people stayed silent. And in that silence, the rules remained strong. Because power, left unchallenged, becomes sacred. And when power becomes sacred, it no longer needs to prove itself. It just needs to be feared. Over time, the rituals of punishment became as structured as the rituals of worship. There were formal steps, summons issued with wax seals, hearings held in stone halls, accused led in with ropes around their wrists, not always to be condemned, sometimes just to be warned. But a warning delivered in public, under torchlight, before neighbors and strangers alike, carried weight. You didn't have to be removed by sentence to be broken. Sometimes the sentence was exile. You were told to leave your town, your land, your family, and never return. And in a world without maps, money, or friends, exile could be a slower death, a quiet erasure, where your name faded from memory, faster than your footprints vanished in the dirt behind you. Other times, the penalty was branding, a literal mark, removed by sentence into skin, to tell others what you had been. Outcast, nonconformist, suspect, a badge of shame worn for life. It didn't just close doors. It made you a target for insult, for violence, for silence. And yet, even with all this, the questions never stopped. A man reads a passage from Scripture and sees something different. A woman dreams a vision that doesn't match the priest's sermon. A traveler tells of other lands, other gods, other ways of understanding the world. And in those moments, tiny cracks form, not rebellions, just doubt. But doubt, once planted, is hard to kill. So the church created symbols, sacred images placed on walls, statues kissed by the faithful, relics guarded in glass. These were anchors, meant to hold belief in place, meant to remind people what was true, what was safe, what was expected. And for many, it worked. The sight of a crucifix brought comfort. The smell of incense felt like peace. The rhythm of the Mass was the heartbeat of life. But for others, those same things became reminders of loss, of friends taken, books removed by sentence, words silenced. In some places, fear became so constant that people learned to watch their own thoughts, to catch stray questions before they fully formed, to nod before the priest even finished speaking, to whisper extra prayers, just in case. Children were taught early, taught to confess not only actions, but thoughts, taught to obey not only parents, but priests, laws, and the invisible silence of heaven. And still, the fear grew, because belief, when tied to power, must always defend itself. And when power feels threatened, it strikes. Even if the threat is just a story passed between two farmers after sunset. Even if the danger is just a poem scratched on wood. Even if the outcast is just a man who lit a candle and said the wrong words before bed. Because in the end, it wasn't about the words. It was about control. Control doesn't need noise. It thrives in silence. The silence of people who stop asking, who stop reading, who stop trusting even their own memories. Over time, whole villages forgot what they once believed. Old songs vanished. Rites disappeared. Stories told for generations faded into dust. Not because they were disproven, but because it was safer not to remember. Fear reshapes culture. A field that once held a midsummer fire now grows wheat. A grove where children once danced is fenced off, marked as cursed. A name once spoken in reverence becomes forbidden, and no one says why. They just don't. And that silence passes from parent to child until no one even asks. In some places, the church built new structures over old ones, chapels over shrines, crosses where stones once stood. It wasn't just practical. It was symbolic, a covering of the past, a rewriting of the ground itself. And beneath those floors, the bones of another world remained, quiet, unmoving, half remembered. Some priests didn't agree with the punishments. They saw the fear. They heard the confessions spoken with trembling voices. But they too were bound. A priest who questioned the Inquisition might find himself summoned. A bishop who preached mercy too loudly might be accused of sympathy, and sympathy, in an age of purity, was treated like infection. So even the kind stayed quiet. In the great cities, thinkers whispered behind doors. Debates were held in coded language. Letters removed by sentence after reading. Manuscripts passed from hand to hand like stolen treasure. The people who held them weren't rebels. They were readers, seekers, people who believed that truth could survive fire if it moved fast enough. But books are fragile, and the fire was patient. In some cases, those books survived, buried in walls, hidden in wells, coated in wax and tucked inside statues. Discovered centuries later, their pages still intact. Proof that not everyone accepted the silence. Proof that belief isn't always loud, but it is stubborn. Still, most people weren't hiding books. They were hiding thoughts. A doubt felt while kneeling in church. A prayer that felt empty. A moment when their eyes met someone else's across the pew. And they both knew. They didn't believe. Not fully. Not the way they were supposed to. But belief doesn't need to be full. It just needs to be public. You could believe nothing, but if you walked the right path, knelt at the right time, and repeated the words with the right tone, you were safe. Mostly. Until someone noticed your hesitation, or remembered something you said years ago, or decided they needed someone else to blame. And then the silence broke. But not in your favor. Once accused, you were no longer a person. You were a possibility, a threat wrapped in skin. It didn't matter if you were a farmer, a healer, a teacher, or a child. If someone said you doubted, then doubt became your name. And that name followed you into every room, every record, every whispered conversation. The process began with isolation. You were removed from your home, your family, your life, placed in a cell, not always a dungeon, sometimes a simple room with stone walls and a wooden stool. But it wasn't the room that hurt. It was the waiting, the not knowing, the slow erosion of time. You were asked questions, at first, gently, then repeatedly, then with pressure. They didn't always want answers. They wanted you to break, because a broken confession looked better on paper, easier to explain, easier to file away. And the questions were always the same. Who taught you this? When did you stop believing? Who else is like you? Sometimes people answered, not because they knew, but because it made the pain stop, because after 3 days without sleep, a name comes easier than silence. And once one name was spoken, the next was easier, then another, and another. It spread like fire. Soon, it wasn't one outcast. It was 5, then 20, then an entire network that never really existed, but now had to be punished, because the records had to be balanced. Some confessed just to protect their families, to take the weight alone. Others refused until the end, even when the end was near, and those who remained silent were seen as the worst, not because of their crimes, but because of their pride, that refusal to bend, that quiet resistance. It enraged the inquisitors. Not all inquisitors were cruel. Some truly believed they were saving souls. That pain was temporary, but eternal damnation was forever, and they saw themselves as guardians of eternity. But belief and cruelty often walked hand in hand, and good intentions, when sharpened into weapons, still drew blood. The trial, when it came, was rarely fair. Witnesses could be anonymous, evidence vague, your words interpreted, rewritten, translated. By the time your sentence was read aloud, it no longer felt like it belonged to you. Sometimes you were given one last chance to confess, to repent, to name others. And if you did, the punishment might be lighter. A monastery, a brand, a long walk in shame. But if you refused, completely refused, then the sentence awaited. The final punishments were public, timed for market days. Crowds gathered, not always in hate, some in fear, some in numbness, some just curious. People of all ages came to witness. Merchants paused their carts, and the condemned walked slowly, sometimes barefoot, sometimes gagged, surrounded by guards who didn't speak. And when the fire was lit, people watched. Some cried, some prayed, some just looked away, but everyone remembered. And that memory was the real punishment, because after that, no one doubted aloud. But not all final punishments were equal. Some were slower, some were staged with care. The church didn't just want to punish, it wanted to teach. So every movement became a symbol. The rope, the robe, the final words spoken. The fire wasn't only about heat, it was about meaning. Cleansing, they called it. A release from error, a return to order through flame. Some outcasts were punished alongside symbolic writings tied to their chest. Pages they had written, scriptures they had translated, proof of the ideas that made them dangerous. As the fire rose, ink turned to smoke, and those watching were told, "This is what happens when truth is challenged." The message was clear. In Spain, during the height of the Inquisition, public autos da fe became ritualized events. Days of ceremony, processions of the accused in matching garments, their crimes written on signs around their necks. Trumpets played, priests chanted. People watched not with surprise, but with expectation. It had become part of life, and not all who walked in those lines were defiant. Some were confused, old, ill, children too young to understand the charges. But the system didn't stop. It rolled forward, fed by confession and fear. And beneath it all, a quiet question remained. What if they weren't guilty? That question didn't matter, because the system didn't need guilt. It needed obedience. And obedience, once demanded for long enough, becomes its own kind of belief. People began to think not in terms of right or wrong, but safe or unsafe. They avoided certain phrases, certain friends, certain books, not because they thought they were wrong, but because they thought they were dangerous. That was enough. And so, over generations, the boundaries of faith narrowed. What once had been diverse, full of local customs, minor differences, was now a single path. One set of words, one structure, one authority. And stepping outside that path was not brave, it was fatal. But still, somewhere, the old words survived. In lullabies, in stories told before sleep, in carved symbols above doorways. People remembered without realizing. A phrase that came naturally, a gesture at the table, a quiet instinct not to speak the name of something sacred aloud. Culture doesn't die easily, even under pressure, even when removed by sentence. It shifts, it bends, it hides, and it waits. Some ideas were too simple to destroy, the belief that kindness mattered, that nature had its own spirit, that suffering wasn't always deserved. These thoughts slipped between the lines, never written, never spoken, but still alive. And sometimes, when no one was watching, someone would light a candle not for a saint, but for a lost ancestor, not in the name of the church, but in the name of memory. And that memory was enough. It kept something breathing, even when everything else was still. As the centuries passed, the world began to shift. Empires rose and fell. Languages changed. Borders moved. But the fear stayed. It lingered like smoke after a long fire, curling around the edges of thought. People no longer saw final punishments every week, but the memory of what could happen if you asked the wrong question, that remained. Even in times of peace, the church watched, quietly, with records, not swords, with informants, not armies. And that was often more effective, because when fear becomes internal, no flames are needed. You light your own fire, you silence your own thoughts. You look in the mirror and practice the right words, the safe answers. And in this silence, another danger grew. Ignorance. Not the kind born of laziness, but the kind born of design. Books were banned, languages suppressed, teachings controlled. You could only read what you were told. You could only speak what was allowed. Anything else was labeled superstition, heresy, madness. So even those who wanted to learn had nowhere to turn. The schools taught one truth. The churches repeated one story. The courts enforced one law. And that law came from a belief system built not only on faith, but on fear of losing control. And still, behind the walls, some remembered. Midwives who passed on quiet knowledge. Storytellers who changed just enough words to avoid suspicion. Elders who sang songs with hidden meanings, where every metaphor was a door to the past. The church tried to stamp out these things, but it couldn't reach every whisper, every dream, every prayer said in the dark. Some traditions survived by changing shape. They wrapped themselves in new symbols. A pagan rite became a saint's day. An ancient herb became holy water. A forbidden story became a parable. Safe, sanitized, but still carrying the shadow of what it once was. And some people learned to live with both. They lit the church candle in the morning and the family candle at night. They wore a cross in public and carved other signs into hidden wood. They knelt during Mass and danced barefoot in forests when the moon was full. Not to rebel, but to remember, because forgetting felt like surrender, and even if the world punished you for your belief, it could never reach the part of you that stayed silent, the part that knew who you were before the fear arrived. But memory alone wasn't always enough. In some regions, fear turned into fatigue. People stopped asking questions, not because they were scared, but because they were tired. Tired of watching neighbors vanish. Tired of codes and secrets. Tired of the weight of stories passed in whispers. Silence wasn't just safety anymore. It became routine. And when silence becomes normal, truth becomes blurry. Children were raised without context. They knew the rituals, but not their origins. They repeated the prayers, but didn't know why. Generations passed, and the fear that once pressed down with fire and rope was now a quiet expectation. You did what was expected because that's how things were done. And slowly, the line between belief and obedience vanished, but in the margins, resistance continued, sometimes in strange places, not in wild forests or mountain caves, but in libraries, in tiny notebooks tucked under floorboards, in coded letters sent across borders, monks who copied banned texts in tiny script, women who taught their daughters hidden symbols stitched into blankets, not to fight, but to preserve, because knowledge, even when buried, grows roots. The church knew this, and so it adapted. It became more careful, more strategic. Less fire, more paper, less gallows, more excommunication. The punishment became reputation. To be called an outcast in some circles was enough to end a life without lifting a single blade. Jobs were lost, marriages ended, homes were seized, friends disappeared, and no one needed to explain, because the accusation alone carried power. Even kings feared it. Some monarchs were devout, others were political, but all of them understood the danger of being on the wrong side of belief. A king who challenged the church didn't just risk his soul. He risked rebellion, invasion, collapse. So many bowed not out of faith, but out of fear of losing the throne, and that fear trickled downward. Priests watched their flocks. Lords watched their tenants. Neighbors watched each other, until everyone was a potential witness, or a potential enemy. And that's what made heresy so dangerous. It wasn't just an idea, it was a crack in the system. A reminder that truth could live outside the walls. And even when the church built those walls taller, added more guards, more rituals, more words, it couldn't catch every breeze. And ideas, once released, move like wind. The wind carried stories, not sermons, but memories, of villages where people once danced in circles at solstice, of trees once honored before churches were built beside them, of songs sung in languages older than Latin. These weren't rebellions, they were echoes, fragments of a world the church had tried to erase, but never fully could. Because even when history is rewritten, traces remain. In architecture, in folklore, in food, in the way someone touches the earth before planting, in the way a mother hums to her child when the moon is full. No one says the old names aloud, but something beneath the surface remembers. And the church, for all its power, understood that forgetting is never complete. That's why it never stopped watching, never stopped adjusting. Councils were held to define orthodoxy. New lists of forbidden books were printed. Saints were replaced. Doctrines revised. Heresies renamed, reshaped, reclassified. And yet, the same questions returned. What is truth? Who decides? What if belief is bigger than the rules? In the universities, thinkers pushed at the edges, quietly, carefully. They wrapped radical thoughts in safe language, disguised doubts as questions, hid critiques in metaphor. Some escaped notice, others didn't. A few were silenced, others fled, and in their exile they wrote letters, manuscripts, the first sparks of something new. Change didn't come quickly, but it came. Printing accelerated it. A book, once rare, became replicable. A single idea could now cross borders without a horse. A man in Germany could read the thoughts of a woman in Spain. A student in France could question the same doctrines as a merchant in Italy, and the church felt it and feared it, not because every book was heresy, but because every book was a risk, a door left slightly open, and behind that door, curiosity, the most dangerous heresy of all. So the lists grew longer, the punishments sharper, but the tide was shifting. Belief was no longer a singular tower. It was becoming a network, still small, still fragile, but spreading, and still, for many, the risks remained. In one town, a man was arrested for owning a book he couldn't even read. In another, a woman was interrogated for teaching her children prayers in the wrong language. In another, a child was questioned because he drew a picture of the sun with a face. Not because these things were evil, but because they were different. And in an age where sameness was survival, difference became suspicion, and suspicion never needed proof, only momentum. Suspicion was a quiet weapon. It didn't strike like a sword. It crept. It spread through glances, pauses, unfinished sentences. You didn't need to be accused. You only needed to be uncertain, unpredictable, not quite like the others. And that was enough, because in a world shaped by one truth, anything outside that shape was a threat. So people reshaped themselves. They adjusted their voices, chose their words, hid their thoughts beneath nods and smiles, not because they lacked belief, but because belief had become a performance, a ritual of safety, not faith. And the church, its rituals, its courts, its laws, kept growing, layer by layer, century by century. It wasn't always cruel. Often, it was quiet, a change in a prayer, a ban on a text, a word replaced in a sermon. Most people didn't notice, or if they did, they didn't speak. But over time, the faith that had once removed by sentence with fire began to settle into habit. And habit is hard to question, especially when the price of a question is exile, or silence, or worse. In some parts of Europe, reform movements began to stir. They didn't reject Christianity. They rejected control. They wanted simplicity, clarity, a return to something honest. And for a time, those ideas spread until they reached the wrong ears. Then the pattern returned. Trials, confessions, punishments. The cycle never truly ended. It only changed form. And sometimes, the punishment wasn't only for belief, but sometimes for lack of visible conformity, for not showing enough zeal, for failing to report someone else's doubt. Faith became competitive, and fear became layered. You feared the inquisitor, but also your neighbor, your spouse, your own children, because if they spoke too freely, if they misunderstood your silence, if they said the wrong thing at the wrong time, the wheel turned again. Some tried to leave. They crossed borders, changed names, disguised their pasts, but in a continent ruled by overlapping churches and watching eyes, escape was rare, and freedom, if found, was fragile. One letter, one visitor, one old record, and the past would find you. Others stayed, not out of hope, but out of exhaustion. They folded into the system, whispered prayers they no longer believed, made peace with the quiet emptiness behind the ritual. Because sometimes survival is its own form of faith, a belief that if you just kept your head down, kept your hands busy, kept your voice soft, you might outlast the fire. You might see the day when no one asked which God you served, or how, or why. But time, like water, wears away even stone. The world outside the church kept moving. Cities grew, trade routes expanded, ideas crossed oceans. And with those ideas came questions no doctrine could fully answer. Not because the answers didn't exist, but because people had changed, their needs had changed, their sense of self had deepened, and the church, though still powerful, began to feel the strain. It wasn't just rebellion, it was reformation. Entire regions began to shift their loyalty, to retranslate the sacred texts, to rebuild their rituals. Some did it through law, others through protest, a few through war. But underneath all of it was the same longing, to believe freely, without fear, without performance, without fire. And yet, fear never vanished. In many places, old patterns held on. Accusations still carried weight. Books were still banned. Some heresies were merely renamed, others hidden in new robes. The structures that once hunted belief now simply redirected it. But for the average person, life continued much the same. They woke early, tended animals, worked fields, prayed when expected, nodded when required, and kept the rest inside, because history had taught them this: words can be dangerous, even when true, especially when true. So the whispers survived, but they didn't grow. They folded inward, became family traditions, superstitions, things you did, not because you understood, but because someone before you had done them. A dish cooked on a certain night, a symbol drawn on a door, a blessing said in a dialect no one remembered how to spell. And in these small things, old beliefs endured, not in defiance, in memory. The memory of voices lost to silence, of names struck from records, of books turned to ash, but also of the ones who remained, the ones who chose to live, even if it meant pretending, even if it meant carrying their truth like a stone in their pocket, never shown, but never dropped. And sometimes that was enough, not to change the world, but to keep something alive inside it. The centuries passed, but the fear left marks, deep ones, in laws, in language, in the way people looked over their shoulder before they spoke. Even as Europe moved toward modernity, the memory of the fire remained. It lived in family stories, in removed by sentence ruins, in the spaces where names should have been. And some of those names were never recovered, because silence is hard to reverse. You can record words, preserve books, but how do you record what wasn't said? The thoughts left unspoken, the songs never sung, the knowledge buried in fear and passed through glances rather than ink. Generations lived with those gaps, and some, quietly, tried to fill them. Historians dug through records, found transcripts of trials, lists of forbidden texts, names scrawled in the margins, and slowly the picture sharpened, not of villains, not of monsters, but of people, confused, hopeful, brave, afraid. They didn't always have the right words. They didn't always agree, but they shared something, an unwillingness to accept a truth that came with chains, and so they were punished in time. Some were honored, statues raised, books republished, their ideas celebrated, but they never saw that. They lived and died in a world where belief could kill, and still they believed, because for some, the danger didn't matter, the silence was worse. And that choice, the choice to speak anyway, is what echoes today. Not in the sermons, not in the cathedrals, but in the freedom to ask, to wonder, to doubt. And in that freedom is a legacy not just of the church, or the state, or the inquisitor, but of those who resisted quietly, by remembering, by surviving, by refusing to let fear write the final word, because belief, in its truest form, is not about obedience. It's about meaning, and when meaning is forced, it dies. But when carried through silence, through memory, through pain, it endures, and sometimes, in the smallest corners of the world, it blooms again. A question asked in school, a book pulled from a dusty shelf, a name whispered without fear, and in that moment, the long shadow of the past flickers, not disappears, but loosens its grip, just enough for someone to finally breathe. Breathing, for some, is an act of defiance, not loud, not violent, just present, just alive, with memory intact, and in that breath is carried the weight of generations, of those who were silenced, erased, punished, not because they harmed, but because they didn't follow, because they saw something else, or nothing at all, and so their stories drifted forward, through time, carried in fragments, a name half remembered, a carving found in an attic, a strange phrase passed down from grandmother to granddaughter, never explained. These aren't myths. They're evidence that fear cannot erase everything. The church still exists. Its halls still echo with chants. Its candles still flicker in the dark. But the fire used for punishment no longer burns. At least, not like before. And while belief still shapes nations, it no longer owns every question. But questions, even now, can be dangerous. Not with flames or trials, perhaps, but with ridicule, with dismissal, with silence of a different kind. And that's why remembering matters. Not to condemn, not to glorify, but to understand what was done, what was lost, what was buried beneath the rules and ashes. Because the story of those who refused Christianity in the Middle Ages is not just about religion. It's about power, about the shape of control and the cost of stepping outside it. And that cost was rarely fair. It didn't fall only on those who spoke loudly. It fell on the quiet ones too, the ones who didn't kneel quite low enough, the ones who hesitated before repeating a prayer, the ones whose gaze lingered too long on a star, or a book, or a question. And in that hesitation, they were seen, marked, named, removed. So today, when we speak their names, if we know them, we do more than remember. We repair, not fully, not perfectly, but enough to remind ourselves that obedience is not always virtue, and silence is not always peace. And that every time we ask who was punished, and why, and what for, we pull one more thread from the fabric of fear, and in that unraveling space is made space for the next story, the next voice, the next breath. The word crusade echoes differently depending on who remembers it. In the West, it was once wrapped in glory, a holy march, knights with shining swords, banners lifted toward heaven, but beneath that shining image lies another truth, one filled with dust, hunger, violence, and the forceful spread of belief. It wasn't just a war, it was a message, a warning. And for those who didn't accept Christianity, it was a storm. The First Crusade, launched in 1096, wasn't only about reclaiming Jerusalem. It was also about defining who belonged to the faith and who did not. And in the shadow of that definition, entire populations were marked for destruction, not just enemies on distant soil, but neighbors. Jews in European towns were slaughtered before a single knight ever left home. Why? Because they were different. Because they did not kneel the same way. Because they held to older truths. In the East, the Crusaders did not arrive as saviors. They arrived as strangers. And to those who lived in Jerusalem, Antioch, Acre, those who followed Islam, Judaism, or local sects of Christianity, the crusade was not holy. It was terror. Towns were removed by sentence, mosques desecrated, libraries destroyed, families broken. And when questioned, the response was always the same. This was the will of God. That phrase, repeated in blood and flame, silenced resistance for generations, but memory survived, carried by survivors, whispered through stories, and it didn't sound like salvation. Not all crusaders were cruel. Some were confused, young, ill-prepared. They walked for months, barefoot, starving, believing they were doing good, that they were promised heaven. But many learned quickly that war did not feel holy. It felt empty, cold, and when they returned, if they returned, they brought home more questions than answers. But the church saw something else. It saw power, and so the crusading spirit was turned inward, not just toward Muslims or Jews or pagans, but toward outcasts. In the early 1200s, a crusade was launched, not across the sea, but into southern France. The target, the Cathars, Christians who believed differently, who rejected the wealth of the church, who preached simplicity, humility, spiritual dualism. Their beliefs weren't violent. Their communities weren't armed. And yet, they were wiped out. Entire cities removed by sentence. Tens of thousands killed. Why? Because they refused to call the church holy. Because they followed a path the church did not control. And from that moment on, crusades no longer needed a distant land. They only needed a difference. The crusade against the Cathars was not led by foreign armies. It was made of neighbors, lords who wanted favor from Rome, bishops who feared losing authority. Common soldiers promised forgiveness of sins if they joined the slaughter. And with every city taken, the message spread farther. To refuse the church was to invite destruction. The city of Béziers was one of the first targets. The people there were warned, surrender the outcasts or face punishment. But Béziers was not a fortress of rebellion. It was a city of mixed beliefs. Some were Catholic, some Cathar. Many simply wanted peace. They refused to divide their neighbors. So the Crusaders entered, and what followed became a grim legend. When asked how to separate the faithful from the outcasts, the papal legate reportedly answered, "Kill them all. God will know his own." And so they did. Men, women, children, removed by sentence, severely harmed, buried beneath the stones of their own homes. No trial, no sermon, just smoke and silence. That was the beginning. Other towns fell soon after. Carcassonne, Minerve, Toulouse. Some surrendered, others resisted, but in each case, the result was the same. Those who survived were broken, their faith outlawed, their books removed by sentence, their language suppressed. And the church claimed victory. But victory over what? Over ideas, over independence, over the belief that salvation did not have to come through gold rings, stone cathedrals, and Latin words spoken by foreign mouths. The Inquisition, which had already taken root, grew stronger after the Crusades. No longer just a tool, it became a system. Trained inquisitors traveled from town to town. They didn't bring armies. They brought parchment, ink, silence, and yet the fear they spread was no less deadly, because now the enemy wasn't just far away. He could be your neighbor, your brother, your child. In some towns, people were required to report those who failed to attend Mass, those who whispered strange prayers, those who refused to eat meat on holy days. The lines blurred between piety and paranoia, and the punishment for failure was always public. A penance in the square, a scar on the skin, a rope around the neck. Inquisitors kept records. Every confession documented, every name catalogued. Generations of fear, bound in leather and stored in towers. And yet, behind those names were people, real lives, ordinary hopes, quiet doubts that never had the chance to be spoken without fear. Some resisted, secretly, in forests, caves, abandoned shrines. They passed stories by firelight, shared forbidden texts carved into bone or wood. They did not hope to overthrow the church. They only hoped to preserve something human, something unsanctioned, something true. And for that, they were hunted, because truth, when spoken outside the approved walls, becomes more than dangerous. It becomes sacred. Truth is not always loud. Sometimes it's a flicker, a breath, a word passed in a field while no one's watching. That's how it survived, through murmurs, not proclamations, through questions disguised as prayers, through stories where the meaning lived between the lines. Those who kept the old knowledge were not warriors. They were weavers, shepherds, midwives, teachers, people whose lives were built from simple acts, tending animals, raising children, feeding the sick. But they carried something dangerous: memory. and the church understood that memory was a kind of resistance. So it made forgetting a holy act. People were taught to confess not only their own doubts, but the words and actions of others. Not reporting heresy became heresy. Silence became guilt. Even kindness toward the accused was viewed with suspicion. And slowly, friendship became fear, families fractured. Villages learned to speak in careful phrases, to look away, to survive. In some regions, traveling strangers were met with suspicion. A person who arrived with stories of other lands, other gods, other ways of being, was either ignored or reported. And if they stayed too long, someone would knock at their door, not with welcome, but with questions. Where did you come from? What do you believe? Have you confessed? Inquisitors did not need weapons. Their tools were words, records, patience. They arrived quietly, dressed in black, with books and eyes that missed nothing. They asked the same thing 10 different ways, waited for hesitation, inconsistencies. And when they found it, they wrote it down. And once written, it could not be unwritten. Some people fought back with silence. Others tried to vanish. They moved into forests, built shelters near cliffs, kept to themselves. But nature is not enough protection when fear has already infected the roots of a society. Even far from the city, people carried the habits of obedience. They questioned strangers, distrusted difference, reported shadows, and the church didn't always need to send its own. Sometimes the people punished each other. A girl accused her grandmother of teaching her forbidden songs. A man turned in his friend for skipping a feast day. A wife was interrogated for refusing to testify against her husband. And each time, another thread was cut. Not just from a person, but from a tradition, a story, a line of thought that had survived for generations, now broken by fear. Yet some threads were stronger. There are stories of wandering teachers who never gave their names, of books bound in cloth and buried beneath stones, of drawings on walls deep in caves, where symbols spoke louder than sermons. These fragments still surface, not in history books, but in rituals passed quietly, in gestures that don't match the official prayer, in recipes with no written origin, in lullabies where no one remembers the last verse. Because even in the face of fire, people tried to remember, not to start revolutions, just to not forget who they were. In the quietest places, where no roads reached and no bells rang, belief moved differently. There were no altars, no sermons, just wind, trees, stone, and memory. People there didn't speak of God the way priests did. They spoke of the land, the sky, the seasons. Life was a cycle, not a ladder. And though they paid their taxes, sent their sons to the cities, and nodded when asked, they did not forget what their grandmothers had taught them. But memory was no longer safe. It wasn't just the inquisitors. It was the villagers, the merchants, the tired men who had once seen flames rise in the square and promised themselves they would never be the one accused. And to avoid that fate, they watched others closely. A woman who gave herbs for fever was asked where she learned it. A man who hummed an unfamiliar tune was told to visit the priest. A boy who spoke to animals was told to keep his eyes low. because difference, no matter how small, had become a mirror, a reflection of everything that could be wrong, everything that might threaten the delicate order that held the village together. The church encouraged it, not through violence, but through rhythm, the rhythm of rituals, feasts, confessions, sermons, the repetition of one truth, one path, one salvation. The more it repeated, the deeper it sank, until even those who doubted started to believe, not in the teachings themselves, but in the danger of not following them. And so, the world grew quieter, but not still, because there were always those who remembered the space before the silence. They passed it down as best they could. A girl carving a symbol into bread crust, an old man drawing shapes in the dirt before planting, a story told without names, where the hero doesn't pray, but listens to wind. It wasn't rebellion. It was continuity. And that's what made it dangerous, because the church could punish defiance. It could crush revolts. It could burn books, but it could not always see what was hidden in daily life, what was folded into sleep, what was whispered to a child just before dawn. And sometimes, when no one was watching, someone would walk into the forest, lay their hand on a stone, and speak to the sky, not with fear, not with guilt, but with memory. And that memory, soft and small, was the one thing the church could never fully extinguish. Not with fire, not with ink, not with silence, because it lived in places they could never fully enter, in lands closer to the edges of empire, where maps faded and rivers bent without names. The church's grasp loosened, not vanished, never fully, but softened, stretched thin over distance and uncertainty. These were places where letters from Rome arrived late, if at all, where priests spoke broken Latin, if they spoke it at all, where rituals were copied from memory, not scripture. And in these spaces, belief became layered. You might attend Mass in the morning, then walk into the woods and leave flowers on a stone that no one had ever consecrated. You might sing the church's hymns, but only after singing the song your mother taught you, one with no saints, no angels, only wind and earth and fire. And no one said anything, not aloud, because everyone did it. Even the priest, perhaps, because in these regions, faith was survival, not purity. It had to bend with the seasons, with hunger, with illness, with the slow decay of tradition turned to law. There was no room for heresy here, not because it was welcome, but because it had no name. No one came to ask what you believed. They only asked if you were kind, if your sheep were healthy, if your roof didn't leak. But silence is never permanent. Eventually, someone noticed. A bishop visited. A papal delegate arrived. A nobleman, eager for favor, reported his own tenets. And then the rhythm changed. The village was summoned, not with fire at first, but with questions. Why don't you say the full prayer? Why does your feast fall on the wrong date? Why do your children draw birds with human eyes? And the people looked at each other, confused. They had always done it this way, their parents and their parents before them. They didn't think it was heresy. It was just life. But the Inquisitor didn't see life. He saw deviation. and deviation, by then, was enough. So one by one, they were asked to confess. Some refused, some agreed. Some didn't understand what was being asked. And still, the records were made, the names written, the punishments chosen. And when it was over, the village was changed, not destroyed, just quieter. The feast was moved, the songs forgotten, the stone in the forest overgrown, and no one spoke of it again. Because once a place is marked, it doesn't need to burn. It only needs to forget itself. And so belief narrowed again, but in the cracks, small as breath, memory clung, not always in the minds of people, but in the land, the patterns of planting, the way water was fetched, the rhythm of a lullaby with no words, and maybe, many years later, someone would feel something stir. Not knowledge, not doctrine, just a quiet sense that something had been lost. And maybe they would go looking, not for rebellion, but for understanding. Sometimes, understanding doesn't begin with a question. It begins with a feeling, a faint discomfort, a whisper inside the bones. You light a candle and feel it means something more. You step into an old forest, and the silence feels different, older, watching. You hear a word in a language you don't know, but it echoes like something you used to dream. That's how memory wakes up. Not loudly, not clearly, but it stirs, and once stirred, it doesn't rest again. In some corners of Europe, scholars began to dig, literally. They unearthed texts buried in monastery basements, fragments of older rituals, lists of forbidden books, prayers scratched onto the inside of bowls. They didn't always understand what they found, but they wrote it down, preserved it, copied it, and with each word, the silence cracked. The church, by now, had changed. Less fire, more politics, less punishment, more diplomacy, but the old patterns hadn't vanished. They had simply gone underground, woven into law, into bureaucracy, into what could and could not be printed, funded, taught. So the work of remembering remained difficult, but not impossible. A book copied by hand in one village appeared in another, 300 miles away. A story banned in one century was retold in the next as fiction. A symbol carved into a barn door, dismissed as decoration, was matched in 3 other towns, identical in shape, identical in placement, all facing east. And then came the questions, not from rebels, but from children. Why did our ancestors do this? What did it mean? Where did it come from? And the answers were no longer, because that's the rule. They were, we don't know. And in that not knowing, space opened. Space for possibility, for curiosity, for the revival of thought, once buried beneath centuries of fear. Of course, not everyone welcomed it. Some clung tightly to the version of truth they had always known, simpler, clearer, without shadows, and they warned that remembering the old ways might bring chaos, disorder, sin. But others disagreed, because to remember is not to return. It is to understand. And without understanding, we are condemned to repeat not only mistakes, But silences and silence, once used as a weapon, never truly stops cutting. It just changes direction. So people kept digging, into books, into ruins, into themselves. And slowly, belief became a choice again. Not safe, not easy, but real. To believe by choice is different than to believe by force. One carries weight. The other carries fear. And though centuries have passed since the fires dimmed, that difference still matters. In some families, stories survived in fragments. A grandmother's strange habit. A charm hung near the door. A recipe that included a prayer no one could trace. These were not celebrated. They were kept quiet, but they endured. And in that endurance, there was resistance. Not the loud kind, the kind that refuses to forget, even when forgetting would be easier. There are museums now, exhibitions, digital archives, places where you can read the confessions of the accused, written in trembling ink. Their names, their words, their fears, sometimes even their drawings. Marginalia in the corners of interrogation books. Flowers, stars, faces, birds. Not heresy, just humanity. And that's what had been punished. Not doctrine, but humanity. The refusal to surrender wonder. The refusal to collapse entirely into someone else's truth. The refusal to lie, even when lying might save your life. And yet, many did lie, because survival demands compromise. And that, too, must be remembered with mercy. The woman who knelt at the altar, but whispered another name in her heart. The man who signed the confession, but never taught his children the church's words. The boy who nodded when asked, but carved unfamiliar symbols into wood beneath his bed. They were not cowards. They were bridges, carrying forward what little they could through the flood. And for that alone, they mattered. Somewhere in Eastern Europe, a stone circle still stands. Locals pass it on their way to church, never stopping, never mentioning it. But no one builds over it. No one moves it. And once a year, someone always lays a flower there, though no one ever admits it. That is memory. That is faith without a name. And faith without a name is stronger than law, because it cannot be catalogued. It cannot be sentenced. It cannot be rewritten. And sometimes, even now, someone stumbles across a forgotten book, a name carved into wood, a melody that doesn't belong to any known liturgy, and feels something stir, a weight, a pull, a sadness they can't explain. And if they follow it, they do not find rebellion. They find truth, not the kind written in stone, but the kind hidden in silence, the kind that survived not because it was protected, but because someone, somewhere, refused to let it die. Not all truth returns with clarity. Some comes back distorted, warped by time, by translation, by fear. A story passed through 10 generations changes shape. A ritual preserved in secret loses part of its meaning, but even distorted, it carries a signal, a pulse, and that pulse is what survives. In some regions, old beliefs were absorbed, repainted, given new names. A forest spirit became a saint. A fertility rite became a seasonal feast, a protective chant, became a church hymn with slightly different words. These transformations were not accidents. They were strategy. The church understood that total erasure was difficult, but reshaping, that was possible. And so, over time, memory wore a mask. But behind the mask, something older watched. In villages high in the mountains, children were once taught not to whistle at night, not because of demons or devils, but because the wind might answer. No one could say where the teaching came from. It was just known. It was just there. And that just there is where history hides. The church, too, evolved. It learned to move with politics, to adapt to new regimes, to survive revolutions, reformations, renaissances. But in doing so, it left behind questions it never answered. Questions buried under ash and oath. Questions whispered by the people who were never canonized, who were never painted into stained glass, who were never given the dignity of a full grave. And now, those questions return, not with anger, with wonder. What did we lose? What might we remember? What parts of ourselves did we silence just to survive? Because that's what many had done. Survival was never simple. It was a bargain, a quiet decision made at dusk, when no one was listening. Do I speak the truth and lose everything, or do I stay quiet, live, and carry the truth within me? Neither path was wrong. Neither was easy. Both left scars, and those scars stretch across cultures, across languages, across faiths. Some of us descend from the punished, some from the punishing, most from both. Because history is not a straight line. It bends, it repeats, it overlaps. And when we trace the story of those who didn't accept Christianity in the Middle Ages, we are not tracing strangers. We are tracing ourselves. The self we trace in this story is not always proud. Sometimes it's afraid. Sometimes it's silent. Sometimes it walks past the accused, eyes lowered, pretending not to hear the cries. And that, too, is part of the memory. Not every ancestor resisted. Not every community protected its own. Sometimes they chose survival over truth, safety over loyalty. And still, the truth survived. Not everywhere, not always, but enough. Enough to haunt the margins of Scripture. Enough to hum beneath the polished surface of ritual. Enough to pull at the heart of anyone who has ever felt like belief was a costume they were forced to wear. Because belief, when forced, becomes hollow, and a hollow belief echoes strangely in the soul. You feel it when you repeat a prayer you were told to say, but don't understand. When you nod during a sermon, but your thoughts drift toward the sky. When you cross yourself because it's expected, not because it feels right. That echo is not disobedience. It's memory. And memory is stubborn. It lingers in the bones. It stirs when we see injustice disguised as holiness. It rises when we hear stories of those punished, not for violence, not for cruelty, but for asking the wrong question, for lighting a candle at the wrong time, for dreaming differently, even now, long after the last stake was removed by sentence. the echo remains in our language, in our laws, in the idea that questioning sacred things is dangerous. And perhaps it is, but not because the sacred is weak, because power doesn't like to be seen without its armor. And heresy, real heresy, is often just clarity. The clarity to say, I do not believe you. I do not accept this. There must be another way. And in that clarity, there is great risk, but also great freedom. Because the moment you speak it, you step outside the line. You leave the safety of the known and join a very old story, a story told in ash and whispers, a story of those who stood just slightly apart, not out of pride, not out of hate, but out of something quiet and true and often nameless. Those who stood apart rarely wanted to be remembered. They didn't write manifestos. They didn't call themselves heroes. Most of them wanted only to live, to plant their crops, raise their children, honor their ancestors in peace. But the world they lived in demanded more than obedience. It demanded surrender. And when they did not surrender, they were made examples. Yet it's not the punishments we remember most clearly. It's the persistence. The quiet woman who taught her daughters the old ways behind closed doors. The old man who carved forbidden symbols into the rafters of his barn, long after he could no longer read. The child who asked, "Why can't I speak the truth?" They didn't seek to overturn kingdoms. They simply wanted to keep something alive, and that act, that choice to remember, became its own kind of rebellion. The church wrote their names into trial records. Historians sometimes footnoted them, but most vanished from official memory. They survive instead in other forms, in customs no one fully explains, in corners of art, in family habits that feel like instinct. That is the legacy of repression. Not always total destruction, but fragmentation. Truth broken into pieces, and yet, like glass scattered across a floor, those pieces still catch light. Today, we pick them up slowly. We study the files. We translate the confessions. We walk into ruined buildings and feel something heavy in the air. Not guilt, not accusation, but presence. The presence of lives that weren't allowed to unfold naturally, of thoughts that were crushed before they became words, of faith that didn't wear the right robes. And in that presence, there is both grief and power. Grief for what was lost, power in what remains. Because to name what happened is to undo part of its shadow, to say, people were punished for thinking. People were punished for remembering. People were punished for not believing what they were told to believe. And they mattered, not because they resisted with fire or sword, but because they endured, and because we still speak of them now. To endure is not always to survive in body. Sometimes it is simply to leave behind enough that someone, somewhere, notices the absence. A removed by sentence book, a forgotten name, a stone placed deliberately, generations ago, with no inscription, just presence. Presence is powerful. It outlasts fire. It waits beneath layers of silence until someone listens closely enough to feel it. And now, we do. We feel it in the gaps of history, in the two neat stories that skip over the vanished, in the villages, where no one remembers why the forest is still avoided, or why people knock twice before entering a room. We feel it when we speak aloud what was once forbidden, when we ask questions with no fear of punishment, when we recognize that this freedom is not free. It was bought by voices silenced, by lives erased, by choices made in terror, so that someone, someday, might choose differently. And now, here we are, able to choose, to believe or not, to speak or not, to remember or not. That is the final legacy of those who did not accept Christianity in the Middle Ages. Not rebellion, not destruction, but possibility. They made it possible for others to see another way, even if that possibility came at a cost they never saw repaid. Even if their names are now dust, their courage echoes in the small freedoms we take for granted. The ability to believe without permission, to speak truth without begging, to hold silence without suspicion. And so, when we remember them, we do not need to name them all. We only need to say this: they were here, they thought, they felt, they resisted, they mattered, and we remember, not with anger, not with shame, but with care, with the quiet knowing that in every age, someone will be asked to kneel, and in every age, someone else will choose to stand. There was a village far from the roads of kings and armies. It didn't appear on most maps, not because it was hidden, but because no one thought to look. It lay in a shallow valley between two hills that had no names, where fog moved slowly, and the trees bent inward like they were listening. The people there lived quietly. They rose early, they spoke little, they worked with earth and wool and fire. They nodded at travelers, but rarely asked questions. And when the church bell rang, they listened. But the church itself, no one ever entered. It had stood empty for years. No one said why. The doors were closed, but never locked. Dust covered the pews. Moss grew over the altar. The bell still worked, though no one ever pulled the rope. It rang only once each season, always just before sunset, and no one knew who rang it. Some said it was the wind. Others said it was the mountain. But most didn't say anything. Instead, they gathered in the fields when the sun began to lower. They brought food, placed flowers, and sang songs no one had written down. The melodies had no sharp corners. They flowed like water over stone. Some sang with their eyes closed. Some just hummed. But no one laughed. It wasn't celebration. It was memory. And in the center of the field stood a stone. No cross, no carving, just a single, smooth shape. Weathered, silent, older than anyone in the valley. They never spoke its name, because it didn't have one. It was simply always there. A traveler once asked why the church wasn't used. An older woman smiled and said, "It's waiting for someone." But she never explained further, and the traveler left the next morning without asking again. No one was forced to attend the gatherings, but everyone came, even those who didn't sing, even those who brought nothing. And in the quiet after the songs, people sat in circles and listened to stories, not from books, but from memory, of seasons, of stars, of things lost and things still worth keeping. One story told of a time when soldiers came. No one remembered when exactly, just that it happened. They asked questions, demanded names, took the old books from the small schoolhouse. No one resisted, but after they left, the gatherings moved from daylight to twilight, and the bell stopped ringing, except for once each season, and so it remained, quiet, slow, but alive. Some younger villagers left. They wanted noise, motion, cities, but a few returned years later, tired, thinner, unsure of what they had seen. They did not speak much, but when the next gathering came, they sat beside the stone and sang, eyes closed like they had never left. Nothing was written, nothing was taught. The knowledge passed like smoke, unseen, but known. And even those who doubted still came, not out of belief, but out of a feeling they couldn't explain, like remembering a dream they never had, because some truths don't need permission. They just need presence. And in that valley, surrounded by trees that bent like listening figures, truth did not wear a name. It wore silence. One autumn, something changed. Not loudly, not suddenly, just slightly, like when the wind starts blowing from a different direction, but the leaves haven't noticed yet. It began with a letter. A man brought it from the town downriver. He arrived on a gray horse with a saddle too clean for travel. His boots were polished, his coat too fine. He didn't ask for food. He didn't smile. He walked straight to the church, placed the letter on the old door, and left before anyone could speak to him. No one touched the letter for a full day. It sat beneath the carved arch, unopened, heavy in its silence. On the second day, a woman named Mira took it down and placed it on the table at the gathering. She didn't read it aloud. She only said what it meant. "They want someone to come," she said quietly, "to explain what we do." No one asked who they were. No one needed to. The next gathering was quieter than usual. The songs were shorter, the food simpler. And after the last ember of the fire had faded, no one sat near the stone. It stood alone in the mist, untouched. A week passed, then 2. The bell did not ring. Mira went to the church again. She cleaned the doorway, swept the dust from the corners, but she did not open the letter again. And then a man came, not like the first one. This one had mud on his boots, a book under his arm. He smiled, but the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. He asked kind questions. How long has the bell been silent? Do you still celebrate the holy days? Are the children taught properly? No one answered, not out of fear, but because there was nothing to say that would make sense to him. He spoke of guidelines, of traditions, of doctrine. He quoted names that had never passed through their fields, names that had never felt the fog or heard the old songs. And though his words were soft, they felt like iron. Mira listened politely. She thanked him for his care. And when he asked to stay in the village for a while, no one said no, but no one said yes either. He slept in the empty schoolhouse. He ate alone, and each night he wrote in his book by candlelight, glancing out the window often, as if expecting someone to watch. No one did, but everyone knew he was there. when the next gathering came, it was held without fire, without song, without bread. The people sat, but did not speak. They looked at each other, not in fear, but in uncertainty, the kind that comes when something sacred has been touched by hands that do not understand it. And then the bell rang. No one knew who had pulled the rope. Some said it was Mara. Some said it was the wind. But the sound was different. Not wrong, just unfamiliar, like a voice that had forgotten its tone. The man in the schoolhouse smiled when he heard it. He packed his things the next day, left a second letter at the church. This one was never opened. It was taken down and placed under a stone behind the building, where the moss was thickest. And slowly, the village returned to its rhythm. Almost. The gatherings resumed, but the songs were softer. The stone still stood, but now people touched it with hesitation. And once a year, the bell rang, not before sunset, but at noon. A small change, but a change nonetheless. And no one asked why, because some things are easier felt than explained. And because silence, once disturbed, never returns exactly as it was. Years passed. The man with the book never returned, nor did anyone else. The road into the valley began to fade again. Grass grew over the stones. Rain softened the ruts left by the traveler's horse, and those who lived in the village stopped thinking about visitors. The fog returned to its usual rhythm. The trees leaned a little lower. The bell rope, still hanging, began to fray from time and wind. But something had changed. Not everything, but something. The gatherings continued. The food returned. So did the fire. But the songs, they were different. Not erased. Not forbidden. Just quieter. As if the memory had curled inward, folding over itself for protection. Some of the elders still knew the old melodies. Mira among them. She had not aged much, but her voice carried less weight than before. She rarely led the songs now. She simply sat near the stone and watched. Not with sadness, not with fear, just with a kind of quiet waiting. One evening, when the first frost came early and the fire removed by sentence blue at the edges, a young woman approached her. She was not from the valley, but she had lived there long enough to be known. She sat beside Mira and asked, very simply, "Why do we sing?" Mira didn't answer right away. She watched the embers, listened to the night sounds, the soft shuffle of boots in grass, the crack of wood, the faint rustle of someone unfolding a blanket. Then she said, "Because something must be carried." The young woman nodded. She did not ask what something meant. She didn't need to. That winter was long. The river froze early. Supplies from the lowlands didn't come, but no one starved. The people knew how to share. And in the long nights, more questions were asked. Not to challenge, but to understand, and the stories began again. About the stone, the bell, the songs, the time before. But something new entered the stories. Not just memory, but choice. The people no longer sang because they were told to. They sang because they wished to remember, not out of fear, but out of kindness. Because kindness, too, can be a tradition. And in that valley, where the church stood quiet and the hills still had no names. Belief no longer needed to be spoken aloud. It lived in how people tended the fire, in how they placed food at gatherings, in how they looked at each other during the last song. The bell still rang, only once each season, but no one asked who rang it. That mystery had become part of the story, and some said, in time, the story itself would change again. Because stories always do, but as long as someone still sang, as long as someone still placed a hand on the stone, as long as someone still asked the quiet questions, the valley would remember.